G'day mates, it's Busta here. And before the episode begins, I want to give a shout out to Stitch Fix for sponsoring this episode. Stitch Fix is an online personal styling service that finds and delivers clothes, shoes and accessories to fit your body, budget and lifestyle. Just go to stitchfix.com/scared and tell them your sizes, what styles you like and how much you want to spend on each item. You'll be paired with your very own personal stylist who will handpick 5 items to send right to your door. Then, you try them on, pay only for what you love, and return the rest. Shipping, exchanges and returns are always free too. There's no subscription required and you can sign up to receive scheduled shipments or get your fix whenever you want. Stitch Fix's styling fee is only $20, which is applied toward anything you keep from your shipment. I actually signed up to Stitch Fix myself last week and it was super convenient and simple to order with them. The way it works is that you pick what style of clothes you like, what you wear from day to day, along with some other things, and then Stitch Fix takes care of the rest for you with a personal styler. One of the things I was actually really pleasantly surprised about was the wide variety of brands and styles that they have. The things they sell are seriously quality stuff, and I'm really looking forward to my first order. So if you would like to sign up, you can get started now at stitchfix.com/scared, and you'll get an extra 25% off when you keep all 5 items in your box. That's stitchfix.com/scared to get started today. stitchfix.com/scared. I hope you guys take advantage of Stitch Fix's generous offer here, and without further ado, let's begin. So I want to start off by saying that everybody in this story is safe, but it was one of the closest calls that I've ever had in my life, and I feel like I have to tell my story in order to just raise awareness. So I live in a major city in practically the pit of hell state. Born and raised here, and I'm very familiar with my surroundings. I'm also aware of the fact that my city is one of the worst hubs for human trafficking, and living here can be very, very dangerous. But despite all this, though, I've taken pride in knowing that I do everything that I can to remain as safe as possible. I've had some close calls before. A shady landlord gave a stranger copies of my key, and a man tried to enter as soon as I was alone, and other horrifying tales. And I consider myself an avid murderino. I'm pretty prepped, and at the time I had 2 cans of pepper spray, one in my favourite jacket pocket and one velcroed to my desk at work. I also had 2 trusty pocket knives, one always on me and one in my car door pocket. Oh, and my taser, it never leaves my bag. I avoid shady situations, and despite being a small lady, I know my stuff. But my point is that I'm a very paranoid small chihuahua, and I still got into a very scary situation. So it was summer and hot as hell out, and I've got a date with my favourite gal pal, and I swing by her place to pick her up. She tells me that she has a job interview to go to first, and I agree to go with her, and it's no big deal. She's a sweet tiny thing from a small town in the Midwest, and very new to city life and the wild things that can happen here. As we drive into a different city, I ask her about the job. She tells me that it's a modelling gig. Ah, cool, I say. For who? And she says, I found an ad on Craigslist, and it's just for sports clothes. The Craigslist thing sets a small distant alarm off in my head, but I push it to the side for now. I ask her where the heck we're going anyway, and when we pull up to the Starbucks a bit outside of the city, the alarm in my head becomes a little less faint. Relax, I tell myself. I've gone to legit job interviews at coffee shops before, and there's always been a good reason. We arrive first, late still, but end up waiting about 15 minutes, I think. Kinda weird, but Kat's relieved that we're not the rude ones when she gets a text saying that he's finally here. I look around the Starbucks and outside at the parking lot trying to figure out who the mystery man can be when I notice a tall, well-dressed man step out of a black SUV. He smiles at us as he approaches, and I figure that that's our guy. I could have sworn that the SUV had been parked there for a while, though. I ask Kat if she wants me to step in line and grab her a drink, but she practically begs me to stay with her, and so I say okay, I can do that. I didn't think it'd look very professional, but I didn't want to protest. The man, named Jack, leads us to an isolated table outside and doesn't say much about my presence other than it was okay for me to be there. I get on my phone and shoot a text to my fiancé explaining where I was and what I was doing. He shoots back to be careful, and I sit pretty to just watch the show. Jack had this strange accent that I couldn't place my finger on. Looking back, I'm not even sure it was real, to be honest. He starts asking Kat the usual questions, and I notice that she's absolutely bombing the interview pretty much. She doesn't have much experience and didn't bother to bring a portfolio, but despite this, he doesn't seem to care. The alarm in my head is pretty much a whisper at this point, but it completely blares when he asks if she'd be comfortable doing lingerie shoots as well. Dear sweet Kat says that she doesn't have an issue with it, but would prefer to mostly do sports clothing like they had discussed earlier. She asks to see some of his work, and he pulls up a lingerie Instagram. All lingerie and no clothing whatsoever anywhere. He holds it in front of her face and pulls it away immediately, and when she asked if there was more that she'd be doing, Jack says that was it, and hurries the conversation along. He then says that we need to go right now to his studio at a place that he briefly mentioned the name of to sign papers and get everything squared away. It apparently has to be done today because he's not working tomorrow and his co-workers won't do it right. And at this point, I absolutely hate everything about this, and I'm trying to glare some sense into her, but nothing's getting through. Kat agrees though, and he turns his attention to me. He asks, "Do you want to be a part of this too?" I immediately know that there's nothing about this that's professional. I look down at my beat-up docs and green cargo pants, my shirt that has flames and a slightly edgy logo on it, and can't help but scoff. I say, that's not really my thing, I'm just the ride. He studies me for a second and then says that we can all ride with him, directing his attention to Kat. I say, no, I don't want to leave my car and we'll follow you. He looks offended that I butt in, but asks where we're parked. I say, right in front of the store, and I got it. I practically pull Kat to the Jeep and make sure that we walk behind him. And as soon as we get into the car, I lock the doors and try to keep from freaking out. I tell her that we are not going to this thing, but this doesn't feel right. What about the lingerie and all that? Everything I say, though, she just has an excuse for. We pull out of the parking lot and I follow Jack's SUV, but the whole time I'm just trying to figure out how to get out of this. Kat doesn't like the lingerie, but this could be a door for her and she desperately needs the money, so she keeps insisting. She keeps saying to me, what if this is legit? He was alone anyways. You have your knife and spray, right? Of course I do, but I'm 5'2" and this man's 6'3", and Jack could very much have friends. And I don't want to possibly kill or be killed. But we drive along anyway as I just try to talk to her, and we start driving out into the desert at this point. The middle of absolutely nowhere. There's a divider in the road that prevents U-turns at this point, and I just get this really eerie feeling that Jack knew to take us this way. I'm absolutely desperate at this point to get out of this, and I pull out my phone and snap a picture of Jack's SUV license plate. I upload it to Snapchat where friends can see it, and Kat starts getting uncomfortable too once she realizes just how far we've driven. The name of the place he mentioned springs back into my head, and I know it's familiar from somewhere. A commercial jingle that's distant but catchy, I think. I tell my friend that it's a restaurant or a hotel or something, I think, and he wouldn't have a studio there, so she should look it up. She does, and it's a casino. Unless this man has rented out a space, there's no way that he would have a studio there, and it's just not consistent with the information that he gave us at all. Kat begins to freak out at this point, and I tell her that this isn't uncommon, and he was trying to confuse us the entire time. Throughout the entire interview, too, she had a confused and kind of hesitant look on her face, like this wasn't what she was promised or expecting at all. Kat finally agrees that we need to get out of there, and I start to breathe easy again. I notice that every 5 minutes or so that there's a break in the medians. It's a rough quick stop and turn around, but it'll have to do, so I do it, and we just absolutely gun it. Kat eventually gets a call from Jack, and at first she ignores it. I convince her, though, to call back, and she gets nothing at all. Like the number had blocked her, and it just didn't go through. I tell her to screenshot the Craigslist ad, but when she looks it up, she can't find it anywhere. It's like every trace of Jack just disappeared. We go back to her apartment, and I tell her that she needs to report it. She promises that she will, but later because she doesn't want her husband to know. He didn't even know that she had this interview to begin with, and she didn't want him to know what happened. But if I hadn't have driven her, she would have gone alone for sure without telling a soul, and who knows what could have happened. I tried not to scold her too badly, but I just reminded her that our city was very different and much more dangerous than where she's from. Since the incident, though, I now have 3 pepper sprays, one for the car, and a new pocket knife to carry around too. Thanks, Dad. I'm also 4 months pregnant and now finally ready to get out of this damn dangerous city. Please be safe out there, guys. It's such a scary world, and be damn careful with Craigslist, whatever you do. My husband and I were at the supermarket, and our baby was being especially fussy, so he took her for a quick drive, the motion of which usually calms her down. It only took about 10 minutes to settle her, and I was still in the store, but was unsure how much longer I'd be, and there's poor cell reception inside, so he pulled back into the parking lot to wait for me. It was an unseasonably nice day, so he took her in the car seat to sit on one of the benches outside the store. He took a business call and had just sat them down, absent-mindedly rocking the carrier, when a woman, well-dressed, mid-30s, average height, fit build, approached them. It's not uncommon for people to ask to play with our baby. She's got big rosy cheeks, soft wisps of gold hair, and the most adorable gurgly toothless grin, especially when she's deep into a good nap. But her nap schedule is paramount, so my husband was preparing to tell the woman that she actually couldn't play with our baby right then. She walked over right in their direction, brimming with nonchalant confidence, and before he can even finish his sentence explaining that she's napping and not to be touched, she just picked up the carrier and started walking off. He was in shock for a minute, and not fully believing someone would be ballsy enough to do something so sinister in plain daylight, so he just said, "Excuse me, put her down," as his panic mounted. She remained calm this entire time, but when he called after her, she started walking away more briskly than when she'd approached. He ran full speed ahead, tried to grapple the carrier out of her hands, finally resulting to restraining her arms, and this woman yells, "Help, he's trying to take my baby. Kidnapping, 911, help," kicking him in the shin and pulling a pink bottle of pepper spray out of her handbag. Of course, no one in the parking lot was clocking the earlier interaction and assumed that he really was a kidnapper. A lone man in a Deadpool t-shirt versus a tiny well-dressed woman. Immediately, a man knocked my husband to the ground and was holding him down too. He could hear bystanders encouraging the woman to file a police report, but she was doing a very convincing job of just acting shaken up and insisted that she just wanted to get home. And to make matters worse for my husband, she was driving a minivan too. He was in a raw state of panic, realizing the entire parking lot had banded together to inadvertently facilitate the kidnapping of our daughter. He was begging and pleading with them, but no one was listening. They just kept screaming at him that the jig was up, and that he needed to lie still and wait for police and stop terrorizing a young mother. My husband finally had the novel idea to show them family pictures on his phone, but too panicked to think clearly, this manifested as him shouting, "I have pictures of the baby on my phone," which, of course, everyone interpreted as having either taken stalking photos or, worse, pornographic images of the baby. It was at this point that a man, and I can't entirely blame the man considering what he thought was going on, kicked my husband as hard as he could in the ribs. It was at this point that I was coming out of the store too, and I thought that he was being robbed by these people or something. I was yelling for security, so panicked that my chest constricted and I could barely get any sound out. It was only then that I realized that he didn't have our baby with him. When I saw that she was being held by a woman, I was actually relieved at first. I thought that maybe the woman had intervened to move my daughter out of harm's way while my husband was being robbed and was just walking away to get help or something. I couldn't find a security guard outside the store, so I ran up to the people holding my husband down, waving my wallet, pleading, "Please, just take everything you want. Just leave us alone." And one of the men holding him down said something like, "Lady, we need to wait for the police to deal with him." And at this point, I was so confused. Why would muggers have called the police? I just kept stammering, "What do you mean? What are you talking about?" and made out someone saying he tried to abduct that woman's kid. I didn't understand, and I was sure that I'd misheard him. My husband would never hurt a child. I mean, we have 4 kids of our own, and if he was going to commit a crime, bringing home another kid would be at the bottom of his list. I kept trying to understand what the man was saying, and suddenly, it all just clicked. I looked around for the woman who had the baby carrier, and she was now halfway across the parking lot. I went into total ballistic tiger cub mode, literally leapt out of my heels and sprinted across the parking lot. I'm not a UFC fighter, and I've never even taken a self-defense class, so all I could think to do was grab the woman by her hair and squeeze her throat with my other hand, which didn't actually do much. She was getting away even as I grappled with her. Amazingly, none of the other bystanders had yet connected that my husband was telling the truth, and this woman was absconding with my baby. I yanked on her hair as hard as I could, and that was enough to make her drop the carrier. I was so scared and surprised that I actually just threw myself on top of the carrier, covering the entire thing like a blanket, and stayed that way without saying or doing anything else. The woman, she fled, and not one person tried to stop her, even though she was clearly leaving with another child that she claimed was hers, which would be pretty damn incriminating if I just watched this scene unfold myself. Within the next couple of minutes, though, police had arrived, and after all that, there were still several bystanders who explained that it was my husband trying to kidnap the baby. The police, to my horror, assumed that she must not have had bad intentions. The first questions they asked me after getting her description weren't investigative. They were questions thinly veiled, trying to convince me not to pursue charges, still placing blame on my husband. A small sampling consisted of, do your husband and baby look dissimilar? Is there a chance that she thought she was abducting the baby and she was just trying to intervene? Could your husband have been doing something inappropriate or violent to the baby that would make her feel compelled to extricate the baby from the situation? Did she seem groggy or confused? Could she have mistaken either of them for her own family members? They spent more time verifying that the baby was actually mine than they concerned themselves with the fact that the baby was not actually hers. My husband had called his brother at that point, who works in an office with a lot of lawyers, and connected with one ASAP who gave us the priceless advice to get every officer's name and badge number, to request copies of the store's security tapes right away, and to escalate our complaint higher up the chain if these officers weren't taking us seriously. And finally, we had reason enough to believe that we were being taken seriously, and we went home and both just shook and cried until we had to get our other kids from school. My husband is seething with rage and grappling with a feeling of helplessness from just how little he was able to do, and also has 2 cracked ribs from when the men kicked in. To the officer's credit, they did ask if we'd like to press charges, but considering the man was genuinely convinced at the time that he was on the right side of intervening in a kidnapping and stayed to talk to the police and apologized profusely when the truth became clear, we declined to press charges. Amazingly and frustratingly, though, there were still people who stuck around to talk to police who were giving my husband dirty looks, and one man who even implored the police to involve CPS to verify that it was really our baby. I used to deliver packages in the mail for a company in the south. A lot of the daily routes were in the hills and the woods too. So last year I had a route that was super deep country. I was used to the back roads and the country now at this job by this point. There's some houses that I stopped at where the driveway is super steep or some other shit. But for the most part, everyone was super friendly out there. Country folk, if you catch my drift. Well, I had a delivery that was down in this long gravel street, but there was only a few houses on my journey to the house that my delivery was at. But still, at this point, I'm totally fine. There's a ton of these types of roads out here, so it wasn't anything out of the norm. Well, I arrive at my destination and there's no mailbox, no driveway, no gravel. You could make out a little bit of a path that has been made from cars driving to the house, but I'm serious when I say that it was a tiny bit. The driveway is maybe 250 yards long with the house at the end of it. I'm only sketched out because I'm in the woods and the land is super unpredictable back here, meaning that you never know when there's just a drop-off. I'm in a huge box truck, so if one tire has to slip off the side, the whole thing is going down with it. So I'm driving literally probably less than a mile an hour, taking my time, being extremely cautious. And as I'm making this drive back to the house, I start kind of checking out my surroundings. I pass a really old brown truck that the ground has started to grow around. Again, super common back here, so it wasn't any biggie. As I get further and further down the driveway, though, I notice that I probably passed about 4 satellite dishes, like cable dishes. I start approaching the house, and this house from the outside looks like it's a Walter White Season 5 style cabin or something. It's pretty much a shack, so I park and kind of just check out my surroundings. After about a minute, I was like, okay, well, I guess I'm just going to deliver it and leave. I walk up to the front door of this cabin thing, and the front door has a large glass window in it. Not modern, think old, like a cabin that was built in the late 50s with no repairs. As I sit the small package down in front of the front door, I glance inside the house, and the main room, which would be like a living room, I'm guessing, is just completely empty. The only thing that's in this room is 2 foldable metal chairs, I think, both unfolded, both facing a corner of the room, but nothing is in the corner. In the meantime, I'm trying to do my job with my right hand, where I keep making very quick glances inside. From what I saw, there was pretty much nothing in the house. It was just a shell. The kitchen may have had some old appliances in it, but I wasn't really paying attention to that part. My sixth senses kicked in at this point, and my brain obviously said that this just isn't right. So I turned around and started walking back to my truck. It was maybe 30 feet away, and I take my hood off my head and take my hat off so that I can have a full peripheral view around me. I immediately start looking to see where the closest neighbor's house is, and I see a building up on the hill just a tiny bit, but it honestly looked like it was on this guy's property. I'm sure that my head was probably just playing major tricks on me, but as I'm walking back to my truck, I just feel a presence. I feel like it's hanging on my back, getting heavier and heavier with every single step closer to the van I took. Well, I make it back to my van, and I just jumped in and locked the doors and checked the back to make sure that no one was there. And shit, the driveway. I back out of this entire driveway while checking my surroundings just everywhere. I make it back onto the road, and as I'm driving down the road, maybe 40 feet away from this dude's entrance of the driveway, there's a trash bag in the middle of the street. It's open just a little bit, so I slow down, and it looks like there's a woman's sweater or something inside. Was that a kill room? Was someone or multiple people being held hostage on that property? Something was definitely up. I immediately contacted my buddy and told him about it, and he suggested that I go back and snap a few pictures. I agreed, and about 5 minutes go by, and I make it back to the address, and the trash bag is completely gone now. I looked everywhere on the street and the side of the street, and it was just gone. I always thought about how I just never know what I'm delivering or who I'm delivering it to. When I first landed this job, I remember thinking how crazy it would be if someone was holding people hostage in their house, torturing them or something, and ordered their food and house supplies online because they're afraid of leaving the house with the kidnapped people alone. And that's all I could think about when dropping off this package. I actually left the job not even a week later for different reasons, but I did tell my boss, and he assured me that he would contact the local police department and take that house off of our normal route schedule. I never heard anything back about it, and I'm unaware if the police went out there and found anything, or people, or just something. I would immediately be called in to tell them what I saw, I guess, if something did come up. And so I'm going to assume that they went out to check it and they didn't find anything. But in the same sense, it makes me wonder about the trash bag immediately disappearing after I left. Did they realize that they messed up and I was going to say something, so they prepared for that? I don't know, and I also have no clue what the address was or how to get there by memory to check it out by myself. But I do think about it very often, and I get these chills down my spine because there was something very odd going on in that place. This happened to me when I was a teenager, and it still haunts me to this day. I was babysitting for my neighbour across the street, Alice. I babysat for her often, almost every weekend in fact, so we were pretty comfortable with one another and we had a good routine. Rarely, Alice would have a sleepover friend, and on this particular night, that was the case. Jennifer was a first-time sleepover date, so she was a bit nervous, but I did my best to make her happy. Alice's parents left at around 6:30 p.m, setting the alarm behind them as they went. I bathed both the girls and got them into bed to watch some Nickelodeon, and it was our usual routine. Once the girls were happy, I went to the kitchen to grab some snacks. It was pouring rain outside, and next to the kitchen was a breakfast nook with glass doors and a series of glass windows. As I was preparing to walk back into the room, the phone rang. Alice's parents called often, so I always answered the phone. I picked up the phone and I asked who it was. The male voice asked me, "Hi, how are you?" And I replied with, "Hi, I'm doing well. Are you calling for Jason, Alice's father? He isn't home, but I can take a message." He says to me, maybe I'm calling to talk to you. Now, my spidey senses weren't tingling just yet, and I figured it was a family member or a friend who was bored and just wanted to chat. I politely but quickly said I had to go, and the girls were calling for me to bring their snacks, so I just quickly hung up the phone. I brought Alice and Jennifer their snacks and was about to settle into the recliner chair in Alice's room when I heard the phone ring again. I hustled back into the kitchen to answer it, without really thinking anything was peculiar, at least not yet. But this time, he started off, and it wasn't angry or aggressive, but he said, "You know it's rude to just hang up on people, don't you?" It was a little hard to hear him over the thunder and the rain, and both girls were calling for me to come back because they were scared of the thunder. So I said, "I'm sorry, I have to get back to the girls. Have a nice night." I heard him say something, but I actually hung up before I could hear what he said. But then, the phone rang again. This time, he said, "Don't hang up on me," with anger in his voice. And I just hung up because I was getting nervous at this point. I went back into the room with the girls and the phone rang again, and at that point, Alice was asking me not to leave her again, so I didn't answer. But the phone rang again and again and again, and 10 minutes then passed without a call, and then the phone rang again, and this time I thought that perhaps it was Alice's parents, so I peeled myself away from the girls to go answer the phone. This time, he screamed at me to not hang up the phone. I told him to leave me alone and that if he called again, I was going to call the cops, and I said that he was a psycho. I hung up the phone and turned around to see Alice and Jennifer were now standing behind me. And they looked terrified, so I offered to get them some ice cream bars from the freezer. I went to the freezer and the phone rang again. Alice answered it this time, and I don't know what he was saying, but I heard screaming and Alice looked absolutely terrified. I grabbed the phone and was about to unleash on him when he said, "That's a nice pink shirt you're wearing." I hung up the phone and realized that not only was I wearing a pink shirt, but that during the second call I received, there was a clap of thunder that I heard on the phone at the same time that I heard it in the house. It wasn't until that moment that the realization, it finally hit me. Now, I was a teenager at that point, thinking I was invincible and having no concept of my own mortality, but a higher sense of consciousness kicked in and guided my next few actions. I hit the light switch in the kitchen as it controlled most of the lights in that immediate area, and I grabbed both girls, their barking dog, Alex, and I shoved all of us into the pantry. The pantry door opened inward, so I pushed us up against the shelves and shoved a giant bag of rice against the door. I then had my back against the shelf, my feet pushing against the rice to help secure the door, and I had a girl in each arm with my hands over their mouths. I pinned the dog between my legs, and although he constantly barked, he somehow knew to stay quiet at that moment. And then the alarm started sounding, and the phone started ringing. All of us were trembling, but I was determined not to cry in front of the girls. I tried to listen, but between the alarm and the thunderstorm, I couldn't hear much. After what felt like an hour, I heard a female's voice calling and asking if anyone was in the house. She was in front of the pantry and announced that she was a police officer and that it was safe to come out. She clearly knew that I wasn't going to take her word on it, so she slid her badge under the door, and I moved one foot from the bag of rice and towed her badge towards me. The police had turned the lights on, so I was able to see from the light streaming in under the pantry door that it was, in fact, a badge. I cautiously made my way out of the pantry, shielding the girls behind me, and the female officer, Officer Wesley, didn't look alarmed at all, and I quickly realized why. Hey guys, I know it's scary when the alarm goes off, but next time you need to answer the phone and let the alarm company know everything's okay, instead of just hiding, alright? Sending officers out to a house isn't a joke. I looked at her incredulously. But we didn't set off the alarm, I said, stammering, and I actually started to cry. I told her that we haven't opened any doors. She looked at me with confusion and said, "Then who made those footprints?" From the back door, the sliding glass door in the kitchen nook, to the pantry and out the front door, there were muddy footprints. And in front of the pantry were a bunch of prints, as if someone had paced in front of the door for a while. The footprints led out of the front door, which was still open when the police arrived too. Obviously, I was hysterical, and the police called Jason and Janelle, Alice's parents, to come home from the restaurant that they were at. Within earshot, but clearly not meant for me to overhear, Officer Wesley's partner informed her that the door in the nook had been pried open. I looked out over the pool deck and could see that there was a trail of footprints, and it had started from the grass and went into the house. They were mostly dissolved at that point due to the rain, but it was very clear that someone had walked from the side of Alice's house and towards the glass door. We waited for Alice's parents to come home before I left, and when the police recounted the night's events, I remember thinking in passing that neither of Alice's parents looked as terrified as I thought that they should have, given the events of the evening and all that. The police walked me home and told my parents what happened, and my mother and father were both very, very upset. A few extra officers patrolled the neighborhood for a few weeks, but they never caught the perpetrator, and nor was he ever heard from again. And obviously, I never babysat for Alice again because I was just too frightened. Fast forward a few years, and Jason, Alice's father, went to prison for tax evasion, or so we were told. Years later, though, when I was home visiting, I ran into Jason as he was leaving the house on his motorcycle. He stopped to chat with me, and I asked him the one nagging question that I'd had for years. Did he really go to jail for tax evasion? She left him for her dead sister's husband, which is pretty dark, and I guess Jason just didn't feel that he needed to keep up any pretenses anymore. He told me that, no, he was actually sent to prison for drug running. He regaled me with the tale of how he was caught in a high-speed chase and bragged how he was one of the biggest dealers in the area for years until he was busted. And then I knew for sure. The person who was calling that night was trying to exact some sort of punishment on Jason. Maybe he was a rival dealer, or maybe Jason worked for him and had pissed him off or something, but that's why Jason and Janelle didn't seem as alarmed as they should have. But by the grace of God and an alarm system, we were not killed that night, but I knew that Jason's actions had led to that night's events, somehow. I just knew it in my gut. It still haunts me to this day, and I think it helped solidify a healthy understanding of my own mortality as well as the depravity that may be with the others. I'm not overly paranoid, thankfully, but I'm definitely cautious, and I think rightly so. And after this, my stupid teenage antics, for the most part, they stopped dead in their tracks. I was born on April 17th of 1998, and I was kidnapped on April 18th that same year by my aunt. About a year prior, my aunt had a baby named Dakota. He was a healthy baby boy by doctor's standards, but unfortunately died of SIDS about 3 months after he was born. And this made my aunt distraught and drew her into a stage of depression. My family came together and offered support, but it was always turned away. My aunt's entire life just seemed to be crumbling as she caught her husband with another woman too. He left her soon after that, and she was left to raise 2 kids and deal with the loss of a third by herself. I've had a lot of theories on why she did everything, but I've chalked it up to mental illness. Now, when I was born, I was at 24 weeks and was 2 pounds. Remarkable, I know. So, my upcoming was no walk in the woods, and more of a battle as my lungs were terribly underdeveloped, causing me to not be able to breathe on my own when I was born. I was actually hospitalized until November of 1998, but I was kidnapped and almost died the day after I was born. My aunt was there with my mother, and when my father arrived, my aunt came out of the OR and told him that my mother was so angry and wanted nothing to do with him. And this resulted in my father not being there for my own birth, because she actually lied. When my mother was in recovery, my aunt was in the NICU, watching as they worked on keeping me alive. She told the doctor that my parents were drug addicts and that's why she had me so early. She actually had me early because of complications with Lyme disease. This resulted in the doctors calling Children's Youth Services and performing a blood test to see if my mother had drugs in her system. She didn't have anything other than what she was given in the hospital. My parents were confused on why they were being investigated, and once they were told of my aunt's accusations against them, my mother and father were furious with her. Now, I need to clarify that the next part here is what I've been told, and I may have some facts missing, but this is what I can account for. So somewhere in this time period, my aunt actually went into my NICU and visited me. Allegedly, she asked to see me in private, and the nurse left. But the nurses said that she must have removed my ventilator and unplugged the heart monitor so it wouldn't flatline when I was taken off it. And by some miracle, I was actually breathing on my own. But my aunt apparently put me in her bag and walked out of the NICU, and no one suspected a thing. A nurse realized that I was missing not soon after, though, and that resulted in police being called and the hospital placed in lockdown. I was found about 10 minutes later by a nurse on the woman's restroom floor next to my aunt, who was trying to end her own life. When we were found, she was unconscious with blood just everywhere and was given immediate care. She lived and was put into police custody as soon as she was cleared by the hospital. As for me, I was barely clinging to life. I stopped breathing and was immediately rushed into emergency surgery, where I had a tracheostomy performed to help me start breathing again without the use of a ventilator. The surgery was almost a complete failure, but I had a miraculous pull-through in the end. I was reunited with my frantic parents that same night and had a security guard outside my room for the next few days too. She was questioned and told the police that she always wanted a little boy. When Dakota died, it just broke her heart. And when she saw me, she apparently knew that I was hers. She thought that I was some sort of gift given to her by God. She was definitely mentally ill, and to be honest, I feel sorry for her and the 2 other kids. But they were taken up by their dad, and hopefully they were given a better life. I'm not entirely sure I've ever met them, and that day, it still gives me goosebumps. I mean, how could someone be that broken on the inside to have the heart to just take another person's child? She's been in a mental institution ever since, and I think that I've only seen her one other time when we visited her for a holiday, but for the life of me, I can't remember much of the encounter, as it was a long time ago. I gotta give it to my mum, though. She's been a champ letting her see me, and my little brother too. I can't imagine the things that she endured during that whole event. But I suppose I can understand why she left her and we didn't see her for years. I still don't know all of the details of that day, and I apologize if this seems a bit jumpy and a bit all over the place, but that's about all the information I've gotten in the past 20 years combined. The thing is that I wasn't actually told about this until I was maybe 12 or 13, I think. Which does make sense, I suppose. The thought of your child's first memory being the story of how they were kidnapped at hospital might not be the healthiest thing for a child, right? I guess I could go and see her to get the full story, at least from her perspective, but I don't really have any intent. Call me harsh, but what she did was extremely harmful, not only to me, but to my family as well, and it could have cost me my life, and for that I suppose that I'll never forgive her. This happened to my dad when he was 17 in 1982. He ran away from home because he was in some kind of trouble. He never told me exactly what he had done, but I knew that he had a pretty crazy youth. To escape getting into trouble, he went to London and stayed in a bar near the train station for a few hours trying to figure out what to do next. Very quickly, he was approached by a man who sat next to him and kept buying him drinks. The man was kind, charming, and it really seemed to empathize with my dad. He offered to let my dad stay with him for a few days, free of charge, and my dad says that he honestly really considered it, actually thinking that he might go there and steal from the man, but changed his mind last minute because the man had actually been kind to him, and so he just went back home. About a year later, he had met my mother and they were watching the news when the same man popped up on the TV having been arrested. He then learned that the man was actually Dennis Nilsen, and was the same man that he'd been talking to for hours in the pub in London. Apparently, when Nilsen appeared on the TV, my dad just turned ghastly white and started immediately shaking. Although it's not my experience, I'm always extremely careful and wary of people that I don't know because of this. Dennis Nilsen actually died in 2018, so luckily, my dad will never see him again. But boy, did he dodge a bullet that day. I lived in Japan for about 10 months a couple of years back as a part of a study abroad program as my placement year for university. I lived in Hiroshima, and pretty much every Japanese person that I met was exactly how you would expect them, generous and respectful. All except this one old lady who just so happened to live in the apartment next to me. It was about a month after I'd been in Japan too, originally from Northern Ireland, so it was quite an adjustment to make, when our group of Gaijins decided that we were going to go to the Seijo Sake Festival. For those who don't know, this is a huge sake, a rice wine drinking festival that, from what I now understand, everyone goes and gets extremely drunk at. As men of fine taste and culture, we sampled many different kinds of sake from all over Japan and got rode off beyond belief. Then we all got the train home back to our apartments, and I can't remember shit all apart from calling my girlfriend at the time and passing out on my futon. Just the normal stuff, you know. So, skip to 6 AM the next morning when my loud as hell doorbell just wakens me up. Keep in mind, my apartment is extremely small, so the noise is extremely loud. I check the time and I'm really confused, but assume it's just my friend from downstairs who wants to talk about last night. I look through the peephole in my door and I see a police officer standing there. The first thought that goes through my mind is, Taylor, what the hell have you done when you got drunk last night? But at the time, I was so sure that I just fell asleep right away. I talked to the dude using a translation app, and he basically tells me that there's been a noise complaint. Strange, considering the fact that all I did was make a phone call and fall asleep. Anyway, the guy sees how confused I am and kind of just sees there must have been a mistake and leaves. I'm honestly still drunk and just super confused, but the day just carries on as normal. Next morning, 6 AM, doorbell rings again. I already kind of assumed what it was going to be this time, and what do I see through the peephole this time? 2 police officers. The same convo goes down, and I convince them that there's been no noise. I literally walk them into my apartment and show them how I fell asleep watching Netflix. They tell me at this point that it's the neighbor, who I've never met, is apparently making the complaints. At this point, I think that she's just a bitch, or maybe she's racist or something, who knows. I asked the guy at my uni who takes care of all the foreign students about this, and he tells me that I'm getting moved apartments to a room on the floor below. I'm pretty pissed about this because I just settled into my new place, but whatever. He plans on coming tomorrow morning with the landlord to move my stuff out and check my new room is okay. You ever get it when you get woken up by something in the middle of the night and it just kind of really messes you up? Well, I went to sleep at a good time that night and prepped for the people helping me move my stuff out the next day. So naturally, at 3 AM I'm fast asleep, and then suddenly, someone's ringing my doorbell just over and over again. The doorbell is just constantly ringing, and it's deafening, and of course it's woken me up straight away. I can't even begin to tell you how scared I was, and I couldn't even move and didn't want to. And after about a minute of what felt like incessant noise, there was complete silence. I make my way over to the front door to look through the peephole, and I don't see anything. But I just know it's this psycho bitch neighbor somehow. Nothing else happens that night, and I eventually do get back to sleep, and I wake up the next morning still kind of shaken, but it's cool because my boys are coming round soon. I keep walking at the front to check if they're downstairs and quickly closing my door behind me because I don't know what this woman will try if she sees me, and I walk into my room and slide the door to my balcony open, and there I see her for the first time. She's literally wrapped her whole body around the fence that separates our balconies whilst keeping her footing on her side and is just staring right at me. We stare at each other for a second, and then she quickly whips back around to her side, and literally 2 seconds later, my doorbell rings, and I'm just like, what? That's not possible. But thank God that it turns out to be the people to help me move my stuff, and I tell them what's up and hastily move downstairs to my new room. Outside of her turning up at my new room once and asking if the police had come there, I was able to avoid her from then on out. And I guess the police decided to just start ignoring her calls. I don't know what she was trying to do by getting into my apartment like she was, but man, when I stepped out of that door and saw her there, mid-flight, almost getting onto my balcony, it was creepy as hell. So I'm Jewish, and I wear 2 items of jewelry which I really like. One is a thumb ring inscribed with a prayer in Hebrew, and the other is a disc inscribed with a Hebrew blessing and a gold Star of David in the center. So I was out for part of the day to get a checkup at the optometrist and to buy some supplies and whatnot. I was heading home, and right outside of my apartment building is an older Aboriginal man. I have nothing against Aboriginals, by the way, but he came up to me and asked for $1. I don't carry cash, and I tried to tell him that, and he looked quite aggressive and probably very high, so when he told me to sit on the wide bench, I did. In hindsight, I know I should have just walked away, but he was definitely high on something that made him really aggressive, and I'm somewhat of a shy person. I was planning on just ignoring him in favor of a cigarette and my book, and then just quietly trying to slip away. But that did not happen, because he immediately started insisting that I take him inside to show him my apartment. Now, there is no way that I was doing that, and repeatedly declined, getting increasingly annoyed the more often he insisted, slurring the entire time too. He asked for my name, and I lied and gave him a fake name. Anytime I made a movement to leave too, he would put his arm in front of my chest. I hate being touched, but I was too shocked and confused and annoyed to tell him off. Within just a few minutes, I was really annoyed, and I was feeling harassed at this point. So I stood up too fast for him to react, and he spotted my necklace. It's a really nice necklace, and I like to wear it a lot, and he got really excited and asked me how much I'd sell it for. I told him that it wasn't for sale, and then he just randomly threatened to slit my throat if I didn't sell it. Well, at that point, I just ran away, and I decided against going in through the front door, as you don't need to use your coded card to get inside during the day. I opted to go around the back of the building and use the back door, which requires the card at all hours and the door shuts faster. I spoke to one of the guys at the reception about a half an hour later, and he wrote down some notes to give to the security. If they see him again, apparently they're going to ask him to leave and call the police if he doesn't. This is definitely not the first time that I've been harassed, but it's certainly the first time I've been harassed by someone definitely high like this. And it's also the first time that someone has tried to force me to invite them inside my home and actually threatened to kill me. This happened a few years back in 2005 when I was around 10, just about to turn 11 too, which would have made my sister 14. We came from a pretty small town in the UK where not much of interest usually happens, and our main attraction is the local shopping centre or mall. My parents would quite often give us pocket money and let us take the bus into town to go to the cinema located inside the shopping centre on weekends. But being a video game obsessed little nerd, it was my ritual at the time to save up some of the money and buy discount pre-owned games from the game station store in the mall. There was something about the build-up of anticipation reading those little booklets they used to have in the game cases on the bus on the way back. I would be off in my own little world, just reeling off facts about the game that I'd learnt from the gaming magazines to my poor sister, who would just smile and nod, humouring me until we got home and she could escape for a breather while I locked myself in my room for a weekend of full-on non-stop gaming. A few months prior to this particular trip, my gran had moved from her old council house in a rundown part of town, which was actually scheduled for demolition, to a new one much closer to our family home. Between our two neighbourhoods ran a main road with a bus stop near to an underpass where we used to get off the bus on our way back from the shopping centre. We'd then use the underpass to cross the road, which was surrounded by wooded areas on both sides. And then we would walk the remaining 10 or 15 minutes from the bus stop to our house. We lived in a kind of suburban zone where buses stopped only at the entrance to the estate and never actually ventured into the streets where the houses stood. Gran's house was the closest of the two to the bus stop. On this day, I follow my sister off the bus, distracted with the stack of games in my hands, my head in the clouds just looking at the screen grabs and the blurbs on the back of the cases as usual. I got the vague sense that my sister was a little tense, but I figured she was just in a rush to get back home and hop on MSN. It's worth pointing out at this time too that we were in the middle of a family feud and my parents weren't exactly on speaking terms with my gran. It had been a while since we had gone to visit her, and my dad had pretty much banned us from seeing her. My sister, though, decides to forego our usual route via the underpass and leads me instead towards the side where our gran's house is located, heading the opposite direction of our town. This surprised me, and being an impatient little jerk, I began questioning her incessantly as to why she was taking me to Gran's house when I desperately wanted to get back home with my haul. She infuriated me further by giving me vague answers like, "It seems like a good day for a walk, and I just want to check how she's doing." Thinking back now, it makes a rock sink deep into my stomach, but I told her Dad had forbidden it and that I was going to walk the other way back to our house by myself and that she could continue by herself. Of course, being the older, street-savvy sister, she wouldn't let me, claiming that our parents would get mad if I showed up alone and that it was her responsibility to look after me. But we kept walking in the direction of Gran's house, and for the first time I start to feel uneasy. I noticed my sister checking over her shoulder and picking up the pace, telling me to hurry up, and I think it's weird, and she keeps very loudly exclaiming how everyone is waiting for us around the corner at Gran's house. Eventually, we arrive and Gran is surprised to see us. She invites us in and we have some biscuits and I play with the dog for a while as we wait for our parents to come and pick us up. But fast forward a month or so later and the incident is more or less forgotten about by me when our town's first and only case of a missing child hits the news. It was on everyone's lips, and I even remember my parents and my friends' parents joining search and rescue parties, scouring the surrounding woodland. Tragically, the boy who went missing was found dead in the woods shortly after the first missing person report was filed. The whole town was just completely rocked, and the main suspect in the case actually committed suicide before the police had a chance to question him. We were all shocked by what had happened. I mean, the boy had been abducted while walking through an underpass on his way to school. This underpass was maybe 4 or 5 stops along from the stop my sister and I alighted at. I was obviously dense and didn't connect the dots until much later when my sister confessed to me that she had decided to take the detour to Grant's house that day after getting an uneasy feeling from some creep sat behind us on the bus who followed us off and stalked us before watching us enter our Grant's house and disappearing in the opposite direction. Her sharp instincts and quick thinking are probably the reason that I'm still alive to tell this story today. That and the fact that my gran had moved to a council house which was miraculously so close to our bus stop. It's amazing to think that one wrong turn and I wouldn't be here. I was living in a city just outside of Pittsburgh a few years back. This city has a major jail located dead in the heart of it, and because neighbouring towns and cities were all nearly an hour away, most people who were released from jail just ended up in shelters here, or even just living here permanently. The jail culture spread to many people on the outside too, and this made for a very, very trashy city environment just all around. Most people knew each other too, and everyone was just in everyone's business. So I was living in what was known as Uptown. This city literally sat in the bottom of a valley, so the hill surrounding the heart of the city formed a literal bowl around it. If you lived in Uptown, you could actually look down on the whole city if you found a clear enough view. But this part of town wasn't really considered as dangerous or as bad as downtown was, so the fact that this happened to me was just really strange in my opinion, because wealthier families, they lived on the outskirts and bizarre things didn't really happen where I was. So it was probably around 3 in the afternoon when I got a knock on the door. When I opened the door, I saw 2 very strange-looking old women, one of them holding a muddy, diaperless baby. This wasn't a toddler, mind you. This was literally an infant who couldn't walk or anything. They immediately assumed that I was the mother to this child and began yelling at me and threatening to call Child Protective Services. I wasn't even 20 years old at the time, and I had 2 younger sisters that I helped look after, so anyone in my neighborhood who knew of me knew that I was kind of a caretaker, whether it be a mother or a sister, but that was about it. I didn't recognize these 2 women as being neighbors too, but I figured that they probably assumed the child was mine because they apparently found it in my yard. When I explained that I wasn't responsible for this child, one of them chimed in with, "So you just leave a baby with no clothes on in your yard and don't call the police?" I explained to her that I wasn't even aware that the baby was there. I'd been in and outside multiple times that day and would have seen or heard the child at some point. It couldn't have walked or crawled there by itself too, and I just had no idea how it got there, or even when it got there, or that it was there at all, to be honest. They went on to call the police and walked away without another word to me and began knocking on other doors. I stayed outside to watch from the porch, and as the police arrived, I noticed a woman with no shoes on and a bathrobe running down the road that intersected with mine. Not even a minute later, she ran back up the hill and I waved her over and asked her if she was looking for someone, and she said yes, her baby had gone missing. She quickly went on to say how scared she was and that she was in the shower and had no idea how the baby got outside or where it went. It couldn't walk and could barely crawl if I had to guess. I pointed to the 2 women talking to the police officer further up my road and told her that they found a baby in my yard. She looked absolutely dumbfounded and jumbled over her own words when she told me that she lived a whole 2 blocks away. She ran up the street and got a good screaming at from those 2 older women. But 2 blocks away? How the hell does an infant who can barely crawl get out of the house and end up 2 blocks away in the amount of time it takes to take a shower? Even if she was in the shower for an hour, I can just imagine this baby falling on the ground and getting absolutely nowhere. I glanced over in the direction of the cross street and I noticed another woman, one that I didn't recognize, walking in an extremely slow and exaggerated gait past my street. Her eyes were like daggers staring at this situation as it was unfolding, and she wasn't paying any attention to the road or what was in front of her, and she was just walking. She could have been a curious neighbor or a passerby who was simply observing, but something about her just made my hair stand on end. She was wearing all black clothes, a black jacket, her hair was long and looked really greasy, and it appeared to be wet. It had to be like 90 degrees outside too in the midday sun, and her eyes were also wide open, like unnaturally wide. Anyway, she paced up and down the road for a good 5 minutes before I just lost interest and went back inside, locked the doors behind me, and that was pretty much it. I decided to use a Starbucks gift card that I got for Christmas this one morning before class. I live in a college town, and I wanted to go to the Starbucks closest to the campus so that I wasn't late to class. This particular Starbucks doesn't have a drive-through window, so I had to walk in. When I walked up to the front door, a man and a woman were sitting at the outdoor table, and they both made eye contact with me, and I remember thinking it was kind of odd because they kind of looked me up and down, if that makes sense. Plus, it's like 30 degrees, and there were clearly open chairs inside. But come to think of it, they didn't even have drinks or anything. I walked inside, though, and ordered my drink like normal, but I could still feel them just staring at me through the front window. But once I got my drink, I started to walk out to my car, passing the two people. I heard both of them stand up and start walking behind me without saying a word. I got really scared and put my car keys in between my knuckles just in case I needed to protect myself. I sped up and got into my car as fast as I could and locked all the doors, and not even 2 seconds later, the woman knocked aggressively on my driver's side window, essentially making me damn near piss myself. The man was right next to her with a straight face, hands in his pockets, looking through the windows of my car as if he was searching for something that he wanted. I cracked the window like a centimetre so she couldn't fit her hand in or anything, and asked her if she needed anything, and she told me to roll down the window more. I just said it was really cold, so I'm going to keep it up, and she then asked me if I could give them some money, and she seemed like she was insisting, not so much asking. I just stumbled over my words and told her that I paid with a gift card and that I'm a poor college kid who didn't have cash, which, to be honest, was true, but it did sound like an excuse, I must admit. The man started to look confused and angry at me, and he yelled at me to get out of the car. And that was when I just noped the hell out of there and drove away as fast as I could. I'm glad I got out of there, but they honestly scared the crap out of me. I probably shouldn't have even talked to them at all, I know, but hey, it is what it is, and I'm just glad that they didn't actually catch me before I got to my car. For reference, I'm from Australia, female, and at the time I was about 15 or so. This story starts with me as a teenager, living at home with my mum, stepdad, and 4 siblings. Back in those days, and having 3 brothers, I was a pretty hardcore gamer. My mum was a pretty heavy sleeper since she was working full-time and also caring for my stepdad, who actually had cancer, so I'd spend most of my nights just staying up late and gaming. One particular night, at about 2 a.m, I could hear someone walking around the backyard. You know that crunching of grass and the slight shuffle of boots on concrete? The fact that the family dog, Sammy, wasn't barking, though, led me to believe that it must have just been my stepdad. My stepdad often walked around the backyard at night to just help with his restless leg syndrome that was caused by the chemo. And so, as far as I was concerned, nothing was out of the ordinary, and I gamed on. Quite a bit later, I heard some more noises in the kitchen, but I again assumed that it was just my stepdad taking painkillers or making a sandwich, which was pretty normal, so I naturally ignored it and gamed on. I eventually went to bed, and when I got up in the morning, my mum was on the phone looking very shaken, and she motioned for me to sit down at the table. I was pretty groggy and out of it, but I started to feel a bit panicked too. Mum was meant to be at work. She rarely had days off, even when she was sick, because she had 5 kids and one very sick husband to take care of. Finally, though, she gets off the phone and sits down. Mum tells me that during the night, someone was in her room. She said that she thought it was my stepdad at first, and the conversation went something like this. My mum said, "What are you doing?" She could see someone near her chest of drawers where her jewelry box was. And he said, "Nothing, go back to sleep." My mum said, "Richard, is that you?" And he said, "Yes, go back to sleep." She was pretty out of it because she was half asleep, but she remembered that something about the whole exchange just didn't feel right. She said that it didn't even sound like my stepdad speaking and that she'd woken up because she heard something drop on the ground. She didn't think too much about it at the time because of how tired she was, so she rolled over and just went back to sleep. In the morning, when she got up, she saw that her jewelry box was on the ground and a few pieces of jewelry were missing, including priceless family heirlooms that were willed to her by her late grandmother. She went to the kitchen and saw that her phone and my stepdad's phone were missing too. So, using the landline, back when people still had those, she calls the police, and we later on learn the rest of the story. Our backyard faces a communal nature walkthrough type of thing, and a man apparently climbed our fence. There's a gate, but we always keep it padlocked, and walked around the house checking all the doors to get inside, which is why I could hear all the shuffling and the scuffling outside. We later learned that my younger sister had snuck the family dog into her bed that night, which is why Sammy didn't bark at the intruder. My mum's bedroom has a sliding door into the backyard, but she never locked it because she didn't see the point. The man had gotten inside through that door and must have noticed the jewelry box, but it was obviously very dark and he dropped it as he went to pick it up, thus waking my mum up. Once they had their little convo and mum had gone back to sleep, he apparently went into the kitchen and started looking for anything of value. He found the phones and pocketed them and promptly left through the laundry door and over the fence. My stepdad had actually chosen that night, of all nights, to take a late-night stroll through the neighborhood to clear his head and help with the restless leg. He'd gotten back after everything had happened and was none the wiser until the morning. The police told us that we weren't the only people whose house was invaded that night, and apparently 4 other houses had been hit, and that there was a huge priority on finding the perpetrator. And funnily enough, my mum's and stepdad's phones were both found in somebody else's house. So thankfully, they got their phones back a few days later. A few weeks after this whole ordeal, we learnt that the intruder had actually been found. Sadly, he'd sold the family heirlooms for drug money. The dude was just a scummy meth head, but allegedly he had a gun in his possession, and it was just luck that no one was harmed with it. He was eventually sent to prison, and for that, I'm grateful. Back when I was 17 to 19, I worked at a small local bakery. There were less than 15 employees spread across all the night and day shifts, so we only had a few people working during the day. But one of these people was Dave, the delivery guy. Dave immediately gave me just an off vibe. He was in his mid-50s and way too friendly to a teenage girl. But the boss told me straight up that, yes, he could be annoying, but no one worked harder than he did, so just ignore his antics. When I signed the paperwork, they never asked me to submit to a background check, and in hindsight, that should have been red flag number 2. Over the course of the year or so that I worked with Dave, I tried very, very hard to ignore him. He was rarely outright creepy, but he was always just a bit too friendly. I mean, he would stick around long after his shift was over to talk to me and the other pastry chef on shift. He always wanted to lick the bowl after I made Rice Krispie treats too, and he would always stand in front of the racks of equipment or ingredients, just enough that sometimes my hand would brush him while reaching for something. He always stood just a little too close too. He was constantly asking me about my life, what I liked, what I did for fun, if I had a boyfriend. Almost daily he would tell me how nice a girl like me should have a boyfriend and how maybe a boyfriend would be good for me. I let this slide because sometimes older people can say things that were meant differently in their time. And then it was concert invites. Every other week he had tickets to one concert or another, and once he figured out my genre of music, it was almost exclusively tickets to bands that I desperately wanted to see, but I also knew that I should not go anywhere with him. I don't like to associate with co-workers outside of work anyway, and I had seen way too many red flags about Dave to trust him for even a second. My birthday came though, and he brought me a t-shirt. It was 2 sizes too small, and he told me to try it on, and I said no. He told me to try it on after work and text him a photo, and he gave me his number. He asked for mine too, and I said no again. He asked the other pastry chef for my number, and she had my back and refused as well. He also brought me tickets to a band that I'd be wanting to see, a VIP section, 21 plus only, and he said that he could get me in, but I had to go with him and him alone. Obviously, I refused, and he told me that he could get me booze, but I just kept declining. For months and months this continued too, and I brought it up with one of my bosses, but they laughed it off as classic Dave. But when he wanted a hug on his birthday and hugged me without my consent, there's Dave for ya. Offering to get me booze or pot? Oh, Dave, you scamp. But when he pulled up his shirt to show me his abdominal scar from a snowboarding accident, well, that's just Dave. Just no respect for boundaries, but a good worker. I seriously considered having one of my big strong male friends come in under the guise of being my boyfriend just to placate Dave. I was repulsed by him, but he hadn't really done anything to classify himself as a predator. Besides asking for my number, he had never tried to harass me outside of work hours, and besides the odd hug or two that I was too afraid and shy to refuse, he hadn't gotten super physical yet. And then one day, Dave was gone. His name just disappeared from the employee roster, and my boss asked to see me in the office. She informed me that Dave was no longer employed at their business. Dave had been fired. And Dave was fired because he was actually a convicted sex offender. Davey here had 2 counts of rape and 1 count of kidnapping a minor from the mid-90s about the time I was born. They had never background checked him, and when they contacted a friend in the police department, they found out that Dave had been lying on lots of paperwork, hiding the fact that he was a convicted felon and not notifying anyone when he moved. Once they brought this information to the police department's attention, they had a few more charges to add. But they found out because apparently he'd been stalking and harassing one of the clients that he delivered to, showing up at her home when he should not have even known where she lived. After his termination, Dave showed up to work one day too. And he had a weapon, but I never found out what he had. They told him to leave or the police would be called, and he ended up leaving in handcuffs, and I'm so thankful that I wasn't there that day. Another little tidbit too is that the police officer my bosses knew had been in the PD for a while and knew one of the officers who had arrested Dave in the 90s. And that abdominal scar was from a run-in with the cops, and he got injured trying to climb over a fence. This was all a few years ago, but sometimes I still think about how badly things could have gotten had I gone to either one of those concerts with him. 2 years ago, my boyfriend, our best guy friend, and myself all attended a Halloween party for a college that we didn't go to. We knew very few people at this party, and at the time of this event, they had all either left or passed out drunk. As most college parties do, people tend to get way too trashed way too early in the night. But college kids, they just don't live up to their partying reputation, because as this story progresses, understand that everyone in this story is probably way too inhibited for their own good aside from my boyfriend, friend, and I, who drink fairly often. The odd dynamic that probably escalated this situation is that my boyfriend and I don't really express PDA, and when I show up with other male friends of mine, people don't necessarily think that I have a date at the party. However, I tend to be pretty standoffish to people I don't know, and take pride in my disengaging attitude that I feel prevents creepy encounters. In other words, I'm not an easy target. Now, this story is about Muhammad, the host of this party. We arrive and find him outside sitting and talking with a girl. As we approach, she just leaves him there. Muhammad tells us that he was just rejected by her, and we pick him back up and give him the plenty of fish in the sea shtick and try not to let it dampen the party. Muhammad takes this as an invitation, unfortunately, and since that moment, he's taking every chance he can to put his arm across my shoulders, getting offended when I brush him off and following us from room to room. Muhammad is absolutely trashed before we even start drinking, so we're hyper-focused on his attempts. We're still just trying to party, so every time he followed us, we would just delicately leave the room, only for him to tag along not only a few seconds later, though. Our suspicions are confirmed too when we're gathering information on our beloved host. We find that the girl who had rejected him earlier, she tells us that she had never met him before, and before we had showed up, he had tried to kiss her, and she was relieved when we interrupted. Other partygoers, when questioned about his behavior, simply said, "Oh, that's just Muhammad when he drinks." My boyfriend and I started kissing sloppily as a defense mechanism so that Muhammad knows that I'm a lady who's spoken for, and I have a boyfriend watch my back every time I go to the bathroom so that I would not be cornered. Muhammad is continuing to drink heavily, and my best guy friend leaves with his DD and leaves my boyfriend and I there. My boyfriend and I are still having a good time, but making plans to leave soon. We intend to drink the place dry before we go, just to spite our rude host. We're terrible people, we know. So, he and I planned ourselves on the couch together with a bottle of Jamio. Cue Muhammad stage left. He has a full cup of beer and can barely make out words or stand upright. He points to my bottle, and I hesitate giving it to him for obvious reasons. He gestures again, and I feign ignorance, and Muhammad grabs this bottle of whiskey and dumps its remains into his beer hastily. He goes to take a satisfied slurp and spills half the contents into my lap. When he realizes that all the attention is on him, he finally stumbles away, and we decide that it's time to leave. In the calm of the storm, my boyfriend and I are in the basement alone, laughing and draining the keg set up there before we can make our escape. And lo and behold, Muhammad stumbles down. Barely coherent, but looking for trouble definitely. My boyfriend suggests that we just make our way past up the stairs and leave, like we'd been doing all night. But Muhammad has other ideas. I step one foot on the stairs, and this drunk asshat put his arm and shoulder across the front of my body to prevent me from leaving. That was a big no-no. My boyfriend and I have been the most easygoing, non-confrontational people all night, but this time we'd had enough. My boyfriend said, "Dude, it's time to stop," before Muhammad lunged at him and they just began brawling. Muhammad, being the more physically inhibited one, is not landing any blows but is too drunk to feel pain, so it takes a bit of struggling for my boyfriend and I to restrain him on the ground. I yell that he better stay there until we leave, and we proceed upstairs to inform his friends where he is. On the first floor of the house, trying to collect ourselves, Muhammad emerges from the basement, and he is pissed. He is completely incoherent, and no one can talk any sense into him. But the scariest part about this were his eyes. They were completely bloodshot and just void of any awareness, almost animal-like. And he goes after my boyfriend and catches me in between them. And so, my boyfriend and I are trying desperately to fend him off together while all the sleepy drunks are just waking up from the screaming. From yours truly. I don't know how screaming would help, but I guess that's what I felt like doing. He finally subsides, and my boyfriend and I fly out the door and into the street, leaving the door wide open behind us. But the weirdest part was when we left the other partygoers, they were yelling, "Dude, what are you doing to Muhammad?" And he says, "I love her." And the partyers reminded him that he didn't even know me. All I can say is that I'm sure glad that I wasn't in that basement alone and that I had my wits about me, because if I had been alone with Muhammad, I'm pretty sure that something terrible would have happened. Before any judgment is placed, I'd like to say that I wasn't in the best state of mind prior to nor during this situation. I had just gone through some particularly difficult situations, and I didn't have a good judge of character and was by far hitting my rock bottom. So, after several months in my mother's home and after a sexual assault, I realized I desperately needed to get out of that atmosphere and try to get back up on my feet. I found a cheap home for rent and began my life all over again, and it wasn't the nicest place, certainly not as warm and comforting as my first place, but it would do temporarily. Shortly after moving in, still not in the right mindset and with huge lack of self-care, I began using almost anything that I could get my hands on. Many psychedelics and MDMA. Anyone who's experienced MDMA can tell you that it gives you this incredible sense of happiness and content, which at the time I had neither. These short-term bouts of false happiness sucked any remaining serotonin from my brain and left me just feeling, if not more, empty inside. On top of that, after my attempt to end my own life, I was abruptly taken off all of my medications, as I used them to hurt myself prior. This meant my sleeping medication, and it trickled down that familiar insomnia. Then my SSRI, which, when stopping abruptly, can exceedingly send you into a state of manic depression and confusion. And last but not least, my anxiety medication. I relied on this for years, and it took me out of my agoraphobia and helped me with my PTSD triggers, which, having my attacker live just several blocks away, on the very same street as another individual whom abused me from ages 11 until 14, I just simply lost all abilities to cope. After some time of intense withdrawals and even experiencing a seizure, I began to buy some pills. The only ones available to me were Xanax, which I quickly developed a tolerance to, and at my worst, was taking anywhere from 12 to 20 milligrams a day. Because of the Xanax abuse, there were many things I didn't completely recall, such as my wedding. It was to a bass-playing musician that I had only known for a month, and as well as much of the month that we spent together, my most vivid memories were lying on the couch watching The Office on Netflix religiously, shaking and sweating in between buys and re-ups from my pill dealer. I began drinking heavily too, and just hanging out with the wrong crowd. The grunge punk crowd. The ones that couch surfed much of their lives and destroyed things in their path, didn't work, and just commonly used other, burning each individual bridge as they passed. As I was in no state to actually care, I enjoyed their company, and one individual in particular, I'll refer to him as Bob, started to become what I thought was my best friend. He even wore a dress at my wedding as my maid of honor. He actually often wore women's clothes, not because he was transgender, but because he simply liked to. Some made fun of him for this, but I thought it was cool that he didn't care what others thought. He really seemed to have a kind of goofy nature about him, and I admired him for that. But as a man that wore women's clothes, he'd often get into my closet, and I'd like to add that Bob had very poor hygiene. He wore no deodorant, he showered rarely, and his feet, those feet, they just left a smell that permanently absorbed into the carpet fibers that stayed, even when I moved out. He would often hop off the couch around 4 p.m. or so and rush to his pizza delivery job, and he never stopped to shower or even brush his teeth. He'd even wake up and just throw back on the same uniform that he'd been wearing for weeks, which stunk of cheap weed and pizza grease and feet. On New Year's Eve 2016, I left my at-the-time husband. After a serious withdrawal and being around him completely sober, it became obvious that he was using meth. I was suspicious of it before, as I used to use when I was much younger, along with nearly half of all my family members. You can just always sense it. He knew before marrying me that this was the big no for me too. My brother in prison and my father's heart attack and death all contributed to meth use. He knew this too when we married, yet kept it a secret. I do blame myself partly for this. It's kind of the thing that occurs when you marry a stranger, right? Anyway, after the separation from my husband, I allowed Bob to stay. He didn't have a room, and he just slept on the couch, and he didn't contribute to groceries or bills, and quite frankly, turned my home into just a disgusting mess. But since my OCD seemed to have dissolved into my drinking, and I preferred not being alone with my thoughts, I didn't really mind. Within a week of leaving my husband, Bob grew increasingly more obsessed with the thought of us being together, though. I made it very clear that I had no intentions with him and valued our friendship, not to mention that I was about to experience my first divorce and all the shame that came along with it. I started avoiding the home, and I started avoiding him. Every time I'd return to the home, he'd be in there in tears, and some days I'd find him not only in my clothes, but also in my bed. Eventually, he quit his job to have a better chance of seeing me. He'd follow me room to room, demanding to know why it is that we can't be together. Eventually, I told him if it didn't stop that he would need to leave. But he was quick to throw back into my face that legally, he was actually a tenant in my home and he needed 30 days' notice. Things grew more aggressive after that too, and I grew more uncomfortable and afraid by the days. His tears, they turned to anger, and his questions turned to screaming. One very vivid memory I have is him staring me directly in the eyes, red-faced, spit flying, and screaming, "I'm sick of being rejected by women." And he was no longer my goofy drinking buddy. He was someone that I absolutely could not be around. The police officer suggested that I get a restraining order to get him off the premises, which I did. Then I kept the doors locked, and his only few possessions in my home were a guitar and amp, which I placed on the back porch and then notified him. He immediately tried to break into the home, kicking the old front door with such force that I could see it begin to crack at the deadbolt, leaving dark shoe prints on the cracked white paint. The police had trouble serving him because he quit his job and he had no actual address, although I provided them with his car description, license plate, and friends' addresses. Morning, noon, and night, I'd find myself crying, pressed up against the door, hoping that it wouldn't break open. Every time I called the police, he had already left too. I'd find myself up at night, just staring at the windows, watching that loud green car of his drive by, feeling my pulse rise, phone in hand. For weeks, I received surprise visits from him too. Most were terrifying, and occasionally, some were thought out. But one evening, he actually had a mutual friend knock on the door, which I happily opened, only for him to quickly jump out from behind the door and attempt entering. I moved as swiftly and strongly as I could to slam that door and lock it. And there was kicking again, calling 911 again, and he'd leave again. After a few months, though, thankfully, he moved on. He found a girlfriend who kicked him out pretty quickly too, and he responded by beating her unconscious and attempting to cut her throat. Luckily, a neighbor heard the commotion and Bob quickly ran. He got off easy on those charges, but of course, if you Google his name, you see the repeated charges of serious assault. I spoke with his exes and I saw the photos of what he'd done to their faces and their bodies. All I can think about is how that could have been me. The last time I saw him was back in my hometown at the local grocery store, as I waited for a cup of coffee after a tiring 10-hour shift at my last job. He nodded with a kind of smile, and I froze, heart throbbing, hands shaking, and it was the day that I moved an hour and a half away. And it's this month that I'll be moving back. Back when I was a kid, my mum and I had a deal. She'd schedule in all my scarier appointments, like dentist visits and vaccines in the morning, and if I went without whining or fussing too much, I'd get to play hooky for the rest of the school day, and we'd get lunch and go to the mall and see a movie and whatnot. This was one of those days. It was a few weeks before Christmas, but the mall was pretty quiet because it was around 1 o'clock on a weekday. I'd had my picture taken with Santa, we'd done some Christmas shopping and had lunch in my favourite restaurant, and we were going to finish off our day with whatever kid's Christmas movie was playing at the time. I don't remember which one it was, but I remember how fun and just pleasant the day had been, and the theatre itself was pretty much empty. Just my mum and I and a few parents with kids too young to be in school. A few minutes later, a single man walked in. I remember him entering because I thought it was weird that he didn't have any kids with him and because he seemed to be spending a lot of time surveying the theatre, the way people do when they're trying to find a seat or two in a crowded auditorium. I also remember him staring at me for quite a while, but then he sat down near the door and I didn't think too much about it. The girl I played with in my neighbourhood had really strict parents, and they always went to see kids' movies alone first to be sure that they approved of them. Maybe his kids went to school with me and he recognised me or something, and that's why his eyes had lingered like they did. Just as the preview started, I realized that I really needed to pee. I had just turned 8 a few months earlier, and my mum was finally letting me do things like that without her accompanying me. As I got up to go, my mum slipped me $10 and told me to get her some candy and soda, a real treat in my house. I was so excited to be trusted to go by myself and to get that candy that I almost didn't notice when the man from earlier got up and followed closely behind me as I left the theatre. I was always allowed to do things by myself more, but my parents had drilled into me that I always needed to be aware of my surroundings and anything that felt off. And the way he bolted from his seat to follow me out of the theatre, it definitely felt off. To give a little context, the movie theatre was attached to the mall, so the main entrance was through the mall itself. To make getting out a little easier, there were a few exit-only doors that led to the parking lot. The restrooms were right next to these. The man followed me all the way to the women's bathroom, and not close enough to immediately spook me if I hadn't noticed him, but close enough that any passerby would assume that he was a father trailing behind his daughter. After I got to the restroom, I peeked out. He had stationed himself just outside the entrance to the bathroom on the side closest to the exit. I told myself that maybe he just needed to use the bathroom too, but clearly he didn't. So I peed and then I waited, and waited, and waited, and then I heard a man's voice just outside joke with someone about how he was waiting for his daughter who was dawdling. I knew my mum wouldn't get worried and come to look for me immediately because she would assume that I was in line to get snacks. But I couldn't get back to her without going past the man, and finally, a nice-looking older woman came in. As she was leaving, I told her that I'd forgotten how to get back to my theatre where my mum was waiting, and could she walk me there. I held her hand tightly as she cheerfully told me that she was glad to help. As we left, the man waiting took a quick step forward like he'd been waiting to grab me, and when he saw that I was with a woman, he turned around and just left out the exit door. I made it back to my mum without incident, and I told her that I didn't see any candy that I wanted, and I was kind of full from lunch anyway. In hindsight, I know I should have told her right away about the creepy guy who followed me, but I was afraid that I'd lose my precious new independence. But looking back as an adult, I still can't figure out any benign intentions that would explain his actions, and I desperately hope that he didn't catch some other little girl unaware. She was a cute little blonde girl, and her name was Terry. We were all in our 20s, and Terry was working at the mall going to school and had no car and lived in a garage apartment. Me and another friend, Donna, met her for lunch at the mall on a Saturday. She told us about a tall blonde man that she kept seeing everywhere. She would see him hanging around the store where she worked, and she would see him on the bus too. A week passed, and I was in the process of moving to the big city in which Terry and Donna lived, and that next Saturday, Donna called me. She said that she was supposed to meet Terry for lunch again, but she didn't show, and she never called or went to work. Donna asked if I'd heard from Terry, and I hadn't. A couple of hours later, Donna called to tell me that she had actually reported Terry as missing. That evening, Donna called again, and she said that Terry was found in a ditch with a neck cut. This was my very first night in my new apartment too, and I was terrified. Both Donna and I had been seen with Terry at the mall several times, and we feared that he might come after us. I stayed up all night that night, just curled in a ball waiting for daylight, and someone actually knocked on my door at midnight. I froze, and they knocked again, and I just held my breath, and eventually they went away, whoever it was. As soon as it was daylight, I threw my meager belongings back in my car, made a call to my brand new employer that I was quitting, and just drove home to my mum and dad. As it turned out, too, it was a tall blonde man that kicked in her apartment door, raped her, dragged her out screaming for her life, drove out to the highway, slit her throat, and dumped her in a ditch like garbage. Apparently, her apartment was attached to somebody else's home who heard the entire ordeal and chose not to call until an entire hour later.